And Councilmember Feinberg and I were at a MML conference a couple summers ago, and there was a meeting, a session on this problem. In the session, we saw almost every hand in the room was raised as who has been impacted personally by the opioid crisis. And I looked at Beryl and I said, wow, I just thought it was us. And she agreed that this is a problem. And we said, let's work together. And we brought it back to Rockville. And here we are with Rockville Goes Purple, following other municipalities throughout the state and the country, Gaithersburg, and I'm sorry, not Gaithersburg. I always give them credit for things, but Hagerstown, Emily Keller, council member, now mayor, came to Rockville and told us all about it. And so thank you, Kathy, for letting us show the trajectory of how we got here. But we are here to support and to continue to offer all the resources that we can to help people overcome this horrible addiction. So thank you.
And thank you, Madam Mayor. And I'm going to go to Councilmember Feinberg. You helped us on the planning committee, so I know you have this very dear to your heart as well.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Ms. Dantzler. For me, it was also acknowledging the stigma that's associated with those who are suffering from addiction, and that contrary to what some may believe, that it's only the downcast and those who are marginalized society, it could be that a mother, a brother, a child becomes addicted. They may have an illness and they need palliative care or pain medicines to get over a hump in an illness. And lo and behold, contrary to any intention to becoming an addicted to Oxycontin or any of the drugs, and of course we know now fentanyl is the really one of the number one problems with combating addiction. It can happen to anyone, slowly and unintentionally. And because of that, I want us to together talk about it, talk about how easy it is to become addicted, but also what are the resources that are available in the community to help combat someone's addiction, regardless of where you live. There are programs that are funded either by the federal, by a state or a county, or even municipal jurisdiction to help one succumb, that we are here for you, you are not alone, and that we think of all of the programs that are here to say, yes, we're here for you today and tomorrow, and there is a future, and you can combat addiction. So for me, it's saying anyone can succumb to becoming addicted, and it does become personal.
Thank you, Councilmember Feinberg. And now I'd like to hear from Councilmember Ashton as well.
Thank you. For me, it's personal as well. I've known people who have lost children, from teens all the way through kids who just graduated college. And those are lives that we can never have back, but we can do something to help others' lives. In addition, I think in general, I think opioid awareness is creating a lot more discussion. I mean, we need more of it because in general, substance abuse is an issue in our country. It's an issue in our city. And for too long, folks have been marginalized, and we need to talk about it because substance abuse is an issue like we deal with chronic diseases, blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes. We need to openly talk about substance abuse because too many people are in the shadows, and they need to know that there are resources and support, that lives can be saved, and we can help people get back on track and prevent it all together. And so my hope is that we, from a public health perspective, really change the narrative on how we talk about substance abuse because too many people and too many lives are not being able to live their full potential. And I think that bringing together this discussion, focusing on it, and letting folks know that you are not alone and that we are a non-judgmental community to gather around and support, we can change where we are now. I also just, particularly after the last 18 months plus of dealing with COVID, we've seen that there's been a lot of mental health stress. And I think it's particularly important that we note that what we've been dealing with COVID is not just an infectious disease, but there are issues going on with mental health that people are struggling with, where finances add stress, where relationships add stress, with not being able to do the things we normally do. And, we've seen some increases in substance abuse. So it's really important we talk about this and we can change the narrative and hopefully save lives.
Thank you so much to all of you. And that is so true, is that our theme this year is opioids. Let's talk about it. And the one thing we want to do is relieve that stigma that people who are addicted to opioids are people who just make bad choices. There are so many things that are involved in this. And Jonathan, even with your advocacy, you feel the same way because you've had it on both ends of the coin, in the justice side of it, and also, in boots on the ground in the field.
It's part of why this is such a systemic problem, that this is not just a problem that exists with individuals or with families or with certain communities. The problems are just top to bottom. And the reason that this year's theme speaks to me so much is I have been across this country. I've been talking to people everywhere, in small towns in North Dakota, all over New Mexico, California, Texas. And the one thing that unifies, the one thing here, it doesn't matter about your race, doesn't matter about your gender, it doesn't matter about your socioeconomic background. The one thing that's true is that the effects of this have impacted every single community. What I've seen, though, is that stigma, if we start talking about it, if we start having these conversations, if we start understanding that the old idea that someone who is addicted, someone who is dependent on chemicals, that they make bad choices, that they're a junkie, what a word to use to describe a human being, to call them junk, to call them garbage. And we can't do that anymore. The idea that we need to destigmatize and we need to be compassionate and understand that these are victims of a very poorly run and poorly regulated industry that was able to make a lot of money on the backs of our friends and our family members.
Exactly. And one thing, the reason why we're here tonight is because Mary Newton, you brought this movie to us. It is the two-part HBO documentary film, The Crime of the Century. And this film, if you haven't watched it, is available right now on HBO On Demand and on HBO Max. It is a very, very attention-grabbing documentary, to say the least. And yes, a little later we will be talking to the director of the documentary, Mr. Alex Gibney, and we'll also be taking questions from you, those who are joining us by WebEx, Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. So let's get into it. What if I told you that the opioid crisis started with a crime, and that crime involved pharmaceutical companies, some doctors, and even the FDA? Well, that's what Alex Gibney's documentary, The Crime of the Century, exposes. Take a look.
I came out of the doctors, and there was a representative of Purdue. She said, we have a drug called OxyContin. Okay. We pick up all the costs. Just take as much as you need. I said, sounds like a deal.
Within the last 20 years, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by overdoses. Controlled release OxyContin would be the drug that triggered the opioid crisis. But what if we discovered that the crisis started with a crime?
When we talk about drugs like oxycodone, you're talking about drugs that are essentially heroin pills. Opioid makers started to promote their opioids for common chronic pain conditions.
Purdue didn't have any evidence that the drug was safe, so the company obtained the help of a medical officer at FDA.
This is the first time I've ever seen this. This isn't just unethical. I think this could be illegal.
Hundreds and hundreds of sales reps go out and meet with doctors and say, the FDA approved this.
Big Pharma celebrated its marketing muscle. using parties to lure doctors to write scripts.
This was a new drug cartel. There were drug dealers wearing suits and lab coats.
Basically, here's some money, write some scripts.
Yes, I'm looking at this and I'm going, clearly we're breaking the law.
Purdue ends up getting pursued by the authorities. The company lied under oath.
Ethics did not play a role. The companies took out their checkbooks and paid to keep the evidence hidden.
You are basically telling pharmaceutical companies you have a green light to do this.
It explains how America got hooked on opioids. Doctors willing to be paid to prescribe the drug, those are the people that are going to get you promoted and eventually put you in prison.
The abuse exploded and spread like cancer.
When you're in that much pain and you're addicted to such a high dose, you're a trap rat.
When the companies didn't like that they were being held accountable, they decided to change the statute.
They should be changing their behaviors, not the rules.
People were dying by the tens of thousands, and their own representatives are basically selling them down the river.
If you talk to people whose lives have been touched, what does matter to a lot of these people is truth.
And that was the trailer to the two-part HBO documentary film, The Crime of the Century. Jonathan, I wanted to ask you a little bit, so you could tell me a little bit more. You were involved in this documentary. So tell me how you got involved with this documentary.
Sure. My background, I was a federal regulator. I'm an attorney. My job was with the Department of Justice Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. And my job was basically to go after doctors and pharmacies in relation to pill mills as we know them now. Almost all of my work when I was at DEA was related to the opioid epidemic. That work led further up the food chain when it comes to the way that opioids are manufactured and the way that they end up on the streets. Without getting too boring and technical with it, is it's all tracked. You have to be licensed to make the drugs, you have to be licensed to sell the drugs, and at every step of that process you have an obligation to uphold the law, to make sure that these drugs aren't getting out on the street, which we call diversion, and to make sure that every order and every customer is a valid one. And as you can probably already guess, it wasn't going that way. It wasn't going that way at all. And as we started moving further up the food chain, going after distributors and pharmacy chains, they began to get unhappy with the work we were doing, and we began to get shut down. At some point, the office that I worked for at DEA, basically all work came to a halt. It was shortly after we had big success against some of the major distributor chains. I left that job. I was very disillusioned and very unhappy. I had gotten into this work to try to help people and to make a difference. And when you're being shut down, you can't help anyone. So I was working in private practice, and I saw the Washington Post had been publishing a series of articles. And I think you just saw in the trailer Scott Hyam and Lenny Bernstein, who were two of the first people at Washington Post that I spoke to. I reached out to just commend them and say, I don't work here anymore, but I worked at this place you're talking about. I saw this firsthand. There's no reason why this should be slowing down when more and more people are dying every single year. We were hitting tens of thousands of Americans dying from opioid overdoses every year. So I reached out to them just to commend them for the work that they were doing and to say thank you, because this story needs to be told. 4 hours later, I was having dinner with Lenny and Scott in Towson, Maryland, where they came up to visit where my office was, and we just talked, and we talked, and we talked, and I didn't think anything would ever come of it. I didn't hear from them for quite some time, and then Scott reached out, and he asked me if I wanted to be able to go on the record, talk about this, and that they had been coordinating with 60 Minutes to do a piece on 60 Minutes. So I still remain one of the only people who was working at DEA at that time who is willing to talk about it, willing to go against these pharmaceutical companies. And that led further down the line when Scott reached out to me again. Scott Hyam said, Alex Gibney's making this documentary, and we'd really love to have you tell your story. And it just, for me, I don't get anything from it other than knowing that the story's getting out there and getting told. And that's been maybe the most important thing I've done in my life.
And it definitely is much appreciated, because I think a lot of people just didn't realize where it started. So the makers of the drug that's meant to help you, meant to, ease your pain. And just personally, I have lupus, so I take pain medication myself to maintain some of, my pain, as lupus, sometimes can bring you. And just to know that a doctor may have the mindset to only prescribe me this, not for my health, but just maybe because they'll get a little bit more funding, or I'll use that as a term. Exactly. But going into that is my next question. In this documentary, there was a pharmaceutical rep, and let's just say he kept bragging about his WIFM appeal. I'm going to show you this clip. You guys are just going to have to watch this clip. Let's see what it has. Michael, go ahead and roll this clip.
There's 4 categories. It's blue, yellow, green, red. Blue is analytical. That means if you don't have a scientific, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with a lot of patients that proves your data is right, you're not getting a sale. What does that mean to me? It means I don't call on analytical doctors because I don't have any studies like that. Then you have your yellow, that's your amiable doctor. They want to be friends with everybody. They want everybody to love them, which means if you're selling a drug and there's 5 other competitors, they just go in a rotation. This one gets Subsys, this one gets Lozanda, this one gets Abstral, and then we go back around. Guess what? They're out because they're just sharing the wealth. So now you got your green, which is kind of like your earthy type of doctor. Like, God forbid you do a lunch and not recycle, you'll never go back there again. But then you got your reds. Reds are your businessmen. They own their practice, they run their practice, they manage their books, they see a crazy number of patients. It's all about efficiency. In fact, when you as the rep walk in there, they run to you with a pen to sign, and they're running away at the same time because they don't have time to talk with you because they're treating patients making money. And if he's a red and he's a businessman, I gotta show him the WIFM. What is the WIFM? WIFM. What's in it for me? That's all they're thinking. What's in it for me? Buddy, will you stop talking about the freaking drug? Will you stop talking about saving the patient? Will you stop talking about the science? And will you please tell me what's in it for me, because you're wasting my time? Those are the reds. Those are the doctors you want to find. And those are the doctors you want to move in, live, eat, and breathe with.
I was raised, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. But when I saw this in that documentary, my mouth literally dropped. That's Alec Burklaw from NS Pharmaceuticals. And he basically was just bragging that he targets doctors. And this is not about making sure what the patient has or needs, but it's all about his WIFM appeal.
Well, I wasn't raised to not say anything bad, but I will refrain for tonight. I will say that this is the example of the morally bankrupt, just absolutely vacant of any ethical code whatsoever behavior that it's presented here in its most extreme. But I can tell you from the years of doing this work, this was the mindset all over the country. And what you have are, there's an obligation under the law, and this is what's supposed to protect people. A doctor has an obligation not to issue a prescription unless it's for a valid medical purpose, and if it's in the usual course of professional practice, which is in the statute boring. What that means is a doctor should not write a prescription unless it is absolutely going to be beneficial to the patient, or if the benefits outweigh the potential dangers, period. Opioids never met that standard, and what you had were doctors, and when I say doctors, there's quotation marks around that, because what we had were businesses where people would come in and there would literally be a cash-only menu, a laminated menu that a doctor would pass across the table, and you would pick how many of your pills you wanted, and you'd pay in cash. This is not any sort of medical practice whatsoever. This is straight drug dealing. And that's the reds that this sales rep is talking about. The sales rep who almost certainly made a fortune off of what he's been doing and how he did this, and with no idea or care or concern about the consequences. You know, we talk about this destigmatizing. I would say you watch that footage, you watch that sales rep, and all the other people who are in the industry who are making money off of this, you watch that footage, and then you compare that to, you know, I was in a small town council meeting. I was there talking about the opioid epidemic, how we got there, opioid litigation that's going on, and basically I got up and I said, our communities are getting devastated. It's not just about the loss of lives. It's about the loss of workforce. It's about the loss in terms of family members who are struggling every single day just to keep going and try to find some hope with their addicted family member. And it's also the costs when we have first responders who now have more opioid calls than anything else, where we have overdoses and they have to administer Narcan, which many of them are not even trained to do at first. Many people are not trained to administer Narcan, but nonetheless, this very expensive and life-saving drug is available. It will reverse an overdose. And I got up and I said, that's one of these costs that your community is bearing, every community is bearing, that had never been built into the budget. And the only reason it's in the budget now is because of what these companies did. And a member of the community got up after me and he said, Narcan? I'll tell you how we solve this Narcan problem and how we solve the opioid epidemic. We stop giving them Narcan and the problem will solve itself. This is the stigma that we're facing when people think that a good result is to let people overdose and die because they're a burden on our communities. A burden which, by the way, was created by people who wanted to get rich.
And that's exactly what this particular documentary film goes in depth with, because again, when people think of the opioid crisis, they instantly go to the people that fall victim to opioid addiction, and they don't understand that this started somewhere. It did start somewhere, and this is what we're trying to do with our Rockville Goes Purple opioid campaign. Opioids, let's talk about it. We need to educate people so that they can have the full spectrum of what this crisis entails, but also to signal hope. That there is hope and that people do care. Now, I played the trailer for the documentary and a clip, and I just wanted to see if the mayor and the council members that are on would like to respond to anything that they just saw. I'll go to Madam Mayor first, if you like.
Sure, but I'm also happy to go to the council members also. Let's start with council members first on this one.
All right. Councilmember Feinberg?
Sure. Thank you very much. As I were watching the trailer, I kept thinking about the trust that patients hand over to doctors to do the right thing, to be transparent. And this is not a condemnation of doctors wholesale. There are many, many fine physicians out there who are not abusing that trust. But for those who did, and it was pointed out in the trailer, it is a crime, because when people are suffering from pain, debilitating chronic pain, they will do almost anything to get out of that pain, to give them some moments of relief. The pain can just crush your spirit, your will to live, your will to spend another day either being unable to move, to navigate through the things that you were normally engaged in day to day in life. And you will look for any relief. And to think of people who you love of any age going to doctors where the doctors have a complicit relationship with the drug salesman is so sad, it's criminal, and it just tugs at your heart. And it says to me, we together as a community must do something. Share information about resources. Say we are here for you. And we need to go after those who are at the beginning of the food chain. And that's what this movie spoke to. Thank you.
And Councilmember Feinberg, I want to thank you that it's such a important point that I don't think is focused on enough that there are always going to be bad actors out there. There are going to be people who want to take advantage of the system. Something that the documentary talks about, something that has become public knowledge over the course of the last few years, is opioids were always known. I mean, we've known opioids were dangerous and deadly and addictive for hundreds of years. I mean, human beings have been aware of this. How do we get from that? How do we get from this almost instinctual knowledge? How do we get from that to doctors prescribing these drugs in ways that are clearly dangerous? And one of the things that is really important for people to understand, because there's a lot of blame to go around, but something that I've learned over the years of doing this work is that doctors, they're not trained in pharmaceuticals at all. It makes perfect sense. We have a whole different industry for that called pharmacists. Doctors only know what is told to them on in the instructions for use. And guess who writes these instructions for use? The companies that make the pills. And the reason that this is important is we have a lot of doctors who will tell you that certain things started happening. Medical schools, who were funded by some of the companies that produced these drugs, began to rewrite their medical books. And the medical books would then be changed to say that now that we have long-term opioids, that it is malpractice to not treat your patient's pain. Pain is the fifth vital sign. It's malpractice if you're not giving your patient these drugs. So you have a new generation of doctors who have learned that that's the base value. You have this system that is, when we have patient response reports that are tied to insurance coverage, and a patient goes to a doctor and they don't get the drugs that they ask for, now the doctor is looking like they're not going to get paid for it. It's a breakdown of this entire system, and it's true. It's not about every doctor was wrong. It's about the way that doctors were taught these new things. It's a system that shouldn't exist in this way. This is not, you want to believe that there's an objectivity to the practice of medicine.
Yeah, exactly. Councilmember Ashton, your reaction.
Thank you. There's a whole lot to unpack in all that. I would say that, there are systems in place to have helped and identified this earlier. You can see how many prescriptions were going out and over prescriptions going out to have moved this earlier. But for me, having grown up in different areas and seen different communities affected by substance use disorder, I've just seen over time, whether it's opioids or another type of substance, that there's sometimes a targeting. It's a targeting of the vulnerable. Communities of poverty have been targeted, and communities in pain have been targeted. And this is no different. And what it all tracks back to is greed. Was there will to stop something that you can see there are more prescriptions happening in these areas than should. So I think that there were physicians involved, as we've seen and heard from the documentary, but it's a larger issue of political will, of lobbying, of tracking and doing the right thing sooner when it matters.
It is a lot to unpack, Councilmember Ashton, and I agree. And this particular documentary film does a great job of explaining the origins of where this part of the crisis began. And I just want to make it clear that if you have an opportunity to look at this documentary, it's called The Crime of the Century. It's a 2-part HBO documentary. It's available right now on HBO On Demand and on HBO Max. It is a very good documentary, and it is very educational, and you walk away feeling very you're going to go through a lot of range of emotions, okay? And there's going to be anger, there's going to be hopelessness, but the key is to know that there is some type of hope. Madam Mayor, did you want to chime in or give basically what we just witnessed with the trailer and the clip that we showed? Is there anything you would like to say or add?
Sure. And I want to just thank you all from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity to talk about something that is so difficult really to talk about, because as everyone has said, this is a system that has become, that this is a problem that has been thrust upon us. I believe it's been intentional. After reading Beth Macy's book, I really believe that people have become addicted not by their own willingness, but because they listen to, as Councilmember Ashton just said, they listen to the professionals who said, you know, this will help alleviate your pain. As Councilmember Feinberg has talked about, everybody has pain of one way or another at some point in their lives. And if you listen to the professional doctor telling you this will help, that's what you rely on. You rely on their expertise. But when they are in the shadows being told something and helping to increase their bottom line, you know, it really hurts. So I'm just so grateful, Kathy, Miss Dancer, for you and everybody putting this on this evening so that we can all talk about it. That's the whole thing, is to bring it out of the shadows, to talk about it. In our family, we didn't talk about it. We thought it was a problem that was, it was just something we blamed someone for, rather than realizing that the real blame rested with the professional. And then because of an addiction that happened because of these pills, which, let's not forget, they are more addictive than anything else out there. And they knew it. They knew this. And I hope I'm not overspeaking right now, but I think Jonathan knows this. The professionals knew that these pills were so addictive, and we've seen what's gone from there. And I thank you for helping us have this conversation this evening.
Madam Mayor, can I ask, just, you mentioned something about just going through it as family and not talking about it. And it really hit me, because if we did talk about it a bit more, it would be something we can bring out into the open and support each other and identify issues earlier. Instead, you know, sometimes people who are experiencing substance misuse, they get cast in the shadows. They do things that make them ostracized from the family, when they actually need us to bring them close and to help them overcome the problem. And it is difficult to watch someone you love go through this, and it seems impossible. And that desire to use again is so powerful and overwhelming. As you said, it seems hard. And I just wanted to let families who are going through it to know that we will not judge you in Rockville, that we want to talk about this. That if you know someone who's going through it, let's get some help. Let's, you know, we will contact us. We will try to get you to folks. Also, Montgomery County has been very involved in helping to train people how to use Narcan. So it is available for free here in the county. We actually had an event on Monday where we were giving kits away, and there's training available. So it seems like a very big problem that is hard to tackle, but there are some things we can do through, you know, reducing the stigma, by getting training, by helping identify early signs, by talking to family members, whether that's your children or your neighbor, about what are the signs and how to overcome a situation if they're put into a scenario where they may be asked, you know, or have to deal with navigating that conversation about use. So I just want to say that there are things we can do. It's not totally beyond our control. It's time that we actually do take back control on this issue.
And I totally agree with you. And I think the other step is, and we have a couple people that I've spoken with recently who have said to their kids, you know, you've got a broken leg, but you don't absolutely have to go to this level of medication, because maybe you don't need that. And pain management is more important than just pain control, right? Manage the pain, figure out what exactly it is, and don't necessarily go to the highest level of pain control first. And I think that's a really great step that we are learning about as a society, is you don't have to go to the final step first. It is there for those who have severe pain. I get it. And I'm not putting anything on that, but we also need to be very careful of our young people and their injuries and pain, and helping that. So thank you.
Thank you so Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Councilmember Feinberg. Go ahead.
No, thank you very much. You know, certainly we are talking about the stigma. The other part of this multi-pronged approach is trying to prevent people from becoming addicted. And as that, not just here in Rockville, but I am proud to say in Montgomery County and in many other jurisdictions, the issue of addiction, yes, it's been thrust upon us, and it does take the political will to say, you know what, we need to do more at the front end to prevent addiction as much as possible. So that those youngsters, middle-aged, older people in all communities, in regardless of color, creed, race, economic level, because addiction can touch anyone, as each of us here, I believe, would acknowledge. So we do the outreach as part of our program and education. I'm really proud that part of this program is also becoming and developing and reinforcing partnerships with our county school system, with our county government, with our nonprofit partners. There are community resources there. If someone is suffering from addiction, there are inpatient programs as well as outpatient. In particular, in Montgomery County, we have the adult drug, which we spoke about at our kickoff event just this past Monday. And during that, we had Judge Debbie Dwyer speak to us about how instead of criminalizing people, we enroll people based on certain eligibility in an extremely intensive program where the person who is trying to overcome addiction has to engage for a long period of time, has certain requirements he or she must accomplish. But the end goal, of course, is that they overcome addiction. I'm so proud that we're in a county where instead of criminalizing people, we want to decriminalize and have a diversion program of the adult drug court. This is another type of program for those who are already suffering addiction. We want to make them, again, a member of society, assist them overcoming their drug dependency, but as well help them so that they can have gainful employment or be a volunteer, but they are engaged. We bring them back with their family. It's a family solution. It's not just the one person solution.
Exactly. And part of our Rockville Goes Purple campaign, if you head to rockvillemd.gov, Rockville Goes Purple, we have a list of resources that are there to help you if you're trying to start your path to your road to recovery, or if there's a family member that needs help, or if you want education. There is a long list of resources that can help you and get you the information that you need. And the one thing that was pretty much echoed through all of our governing body was that the stigma that's tied to opioid addiction, we need to be educated. And it's just not people making bad choices. And one thing that you do, Jonathan, in your advocacy is make sure that people are educated about about opioid addiction.
It's one of the more interesting aspects of this. In the past 5 years of traveling and talking to communities all over the country, my job was a lot harder on the front end. It's really amazing, and I just want to thank the entire city of Rockville, and especially the mayor and the council members, to come and to speak with such an educated, informed group who know exactly what this looks like and understand the compassionate ways that we need to work out of this, to understand that these problems are not just about having addicts on the street. That's not even what it looks like anymore. Every family has someone who's struggling with this. And the important thing, and the thing that makes me really feel good about the work that I've been doing, has been to know that this message has gone from, as everyone was saying earlier, a few years ago, I don't want to get too into it, but I have a family member who has struggled with opioid dependence, and then during a relapse, he ended up a heroin addict. And he will live with that. He's in recovery and he's doing an amazing job. But he's out there, and we didn't talk about it as a family. We didn't talk about it, and I didn't talk to other people about it. It was shame. And I think that everyone is talking about this same thing, this stigma. The education aspect has been so rewarding because now I can go into a room and some people will at least be able to say, you know what? I have a family member that's struggling with this, and it's okay to talk about it. And we have resources. I love that everyone is talking about the resources that are available here in Montgomery County, in the city of Rockville, because it's not, the opioid dependency is not just about getting someone into a rehab program. Traditional rehab programs don't even work for these drugs. A 28-day program, that's not going to be long enough to help someone get the foundational steps that they're going to need. But it's not just that. It's how do we support families who have a family member who's struggling with addiction? How do we reincorporate someone who has been through the court system because of the bad choices that they made when they were in a heavy amount of chemical dependency? How do we get them reintegrated in society? I can tell you that there are foundations in Maryland who are looking at maybe coming up with ways that we can help with expungement of felonies for people who have been a part of, whose only criminal history was dealing with an opioid addiction. These kinds of programs, we need everyone to know about them and to get out there and to say to people, this is what I saw in the Southwest. This is what I saw in Texas. This is what I see all over Maryland. It's helping everyone see that it is a community problem, not just a family problem, not just a city problem, not just a county problem. It's an entire community. United States is the only country in the world that has this problem. 85% of opioids that are consumed in the world, 85% of the opioids consumed in the world are consumed here in the United States. We as a country have to come together and treat it like a community issue.
Exactly. And Judge Deborah Dreyer was part of our kickoff event, and she is with the adult court, drug court, and she has a program too. And there's information on rockvillemd.gov/Rockville Goes Purple with that information as well. Also, for those of you who are joining us via WebEx, Facebook, or Twitter, please, this is not just us talking. We want to hear from you. So if you have a question or you would like to reach out to us, please do so. We're monitoring. So that's why you see me sort of looking down, because I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Because guess what? This discussion, it doesn't just involve us, government officials, Jonathan and later on Mr. Gibney. We want you to be involved because this is a community effort. And like Jonathan said, everyone, we're all in this together. And again, we have a list of resources at rockvillemd.gov/Rockville Goes Purple. And it's a list for you, your family. If you're struggling, if you're on the road to recovery, if you don't know where to start there. Start there. And Jonathan, back to the documentary, because that is what we're here to talk about tonight. And we're expecting Mr. Gibney at any moment. Once he joins in, we'll get him right on the line, and we'll definitely get into that beautiful mind of his and find out more about this documentary. But one thing that I also noticed in the documentary was how they described the opioid drug itself and how it was made. So it was made with things that are supposed to be addictive, right? And then in the documentary, and this is why I say, everyone, if you have an opportunity, please watch this documentary. It's available on demand on HBO and on HBO Max. But there was one person that they gave OxyContin. I think he was taking like 100 pills a day.
It's one of the more fascinating segments of the documentary, and that gentleman was, I would describe him as a biological superhero in regards to his opioid tolerance. I do not mean that as a compliment, but they had a person who could just take as many opioids as they would give him, and he didn't seem to show the negative effects. Obviously, that's a dangerous game to play with another human being's life, but he was used as an example. And you see this in the history of opioids and how they were marketed when OxyContin came on the market. They claimed that these drugs were rarely addictive. I think the documentary mentions the letter to the editor.
Yes.
The letter to the editor story, which is the the how this claim of opioids are rarely addictive gets out there because a doctor was doing a study. A doctor was just keeping notes about how many patients he gave opioids in an emergency setting. And a year later, how many of those people were still on opioids? And he said less than 1% of these people were still on opioids a year later. They didn't talk about the fact that a lot of these people were end-of-life cancer patients. So, of course, they weren't on opioids a year later. But this was instead bolstered as this really just meticulously peer-reviewed study. It was a 2-sentence letter to the editor. A 2-sentence letter to the editor to the New England Medical Journal. There was no study. And this is how they get this idea that opioids are rarely addictive out there. Then you have this example of the gentleman in the documentary who's taking thousands of opioid pills a month.
A month. I mean, they listed, and it wasn't just Oxycontin. It was several different types of opioids, and he was taking them. And it was shocking to me that the fact that they felt like he didn't die, so he's okay. That really bothered me, and I'm trying to be very gentle with my words. I am because it really shocked me for someone who, I'm just going to tell you now, for someone who thinks when I hear documentary, I think, oh gosh, it's going to be boring. It's going to be long. I'm not going to be interested. And I'm telling you, this is not that. This is definitely not that. This is educational. You will go through a range of emotion, but you will be educated too. And this helps sort of shed that stigma. Again, that opioid addiction just starts with people making bad choices. That actually there is a role into people just being prescribed more medicine than they really need or can handle.
It's you know, there's a wide range of emotions that you will go through in this, and I find myself somewhere between absolutely furious that this could happen, and as a former DEA attorney, a former regulator who was seeing these cases and whose group was overseeing this industry at the time that this was happening. And it's just a failure. It's a failure to allow an industry to dominate like this. But there's so much sadness too, and the documentary tells a lot of human stories that will break your heart.
Exactly. And speaking to you, because you, like you said, you were with the DEA at the time. The pharmaceutical rep, the one that was so proud to tell how he did his Whiffam appeal, what you as a litigator, what was your role in that? How did you go after that? I pray that he was held accountable for this.
Unfortunately, and I think a lot of people have seen in the news that a family who owned the company that made OxyContin being the drug that started this entire thing, they're basically paying. They brought out their checkbooks again, and they're getting away with it. And unfortunately, while there's a lot of work being done in litigation right now to try to hold people accountable and try to get some funding back to the communities who have just been faultless in all of this. But there are a lot of people who still haven't been held accountable. And that's going to be up to us to ask our representatives, to ask our prosecutors to say, this is important to us, that people need to be held accountable because this shouldn't happen ever again. This shouldn't be allowed to happen ever again. And hopefully there will be people out there who believe in that and who will stress that and will try to make sure that this isn't just something that people can walk away from after all the damage they've caused.
Thank you, Jonathan. It looks like we have a question from YouTube. The question, can you discuss the racial politics of the opioid epidemic, specifically how the national conversation about opioids it differs from the crack cocaine epidemic was talked about at the height? So basically, how race plays a role in the crisis, in this epidemic crisis. Because remember, not trying to date myself, but I do remember the whole crack is whack and all that. But now with the opioid addiction and the opioid epidemic, is it two sides to the coin?
This is a very good question. I thank you for whoever asked it. It's a very prickly situation. On the one hand, I'm never going to come out myself and say, well, this is the only important drug addiction issue that this country has faced. It's just not true. But there are a lot of people who have noticed that this has been discussed at length. This has become a national topic. We're changing the dialogue from junkies don't deserve our compassion to this affects everyone and therefore there should be compassion. There's a lot of that's true. There's a lot of the fact that this hits certain demographics that the crack epidemic did not. And there's something sour about that. I will readily admit that, and I think that it's something that needs to be discussed. I think that, and I'm not the person to discuss it as a white man who is an attorney. I don't think I'm the person that should be the voice on this, but except to say we should be talking about this.
Exactly. Councilmember Ashton, you're in the public health field. I think maybe you can shed some light on this, possibly.
Yes, I started the conversation going even broader than the opioid crisis, because there are communities I mentioned before who have been targeted, whether you're in pain or whether you're in poverty. And there have been communities that have been treated differently. So I think the person who wrote this is absolutely right. Communities were stigmatized when it was in BIPOC communities. And, we need to change that conversation. For me, as a public health professional, I'm also saying, how do we leverage this to talk about the entire issue, so that we can raise awareness about, the issues of substance misuse, as well as looking at the justice system and things of that sort, so that we can help the entire recovery community. When you look at, for example, the sentencing minimums for crack versus cocaine, I think it was about 5 grams carried a minimum sentence of 5 years, but 500 grams of cocaine carried a 5-year minimum. So you could have much less of one that was in certain demographics of communities, and mostly communities who were impoverished, getting the same sentence for someone who was carrying something at 500. So I think that's something we need to look at. We need to be honest about it and talk about, what issues affect what communities, and make sure that we're treating all communities equally. But in general, substance abuse is a problem in our country. I think it's a bigger problem than, if you look at the number of deaths, more people are dying, more Americans are dying of issues related to drug overdose than are car crashes and HIV/AIDS and gun violence. This is a big issue in our community, whether it's prescribed or not. We need to break down the stigma and help people talk about it. Really, as professionals, as community members, as faith leaders, all come together to say, we believe this is an issue, it's a health issue, it's a mental health issue, and we are here to help versus just to judge and stigmatize. Unless we do that and we keep this in the shadows, we're going to continue to have this problem.
Councilperson Ashton, thank you so much. It's such an important aspect to how we move forward, and something that I think has really been brought to light is this, and why I think this question is so important is it's about equal application of the law. It's about equal access to justice, and this is a way to open that door. And while you can admit that this is an example of, why are we handling this differently than we handled any other of these types of scourges that were more focused on communities of color. While we can admit that there is a difference in how we're handling this, I also think it's an opportunity for us as a society to say, this is how we should handle everything. We should handle it as if it's affecting all of us. It's a way for us to see that the impacts of this kind of epidemic are not just within singular demographics or communities. The trickle down of everything affects our entire nation.
That is so. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Councilmember Feinberg.
Sure, I would just like to add, in addition to what my colleague Councilmember Ashton and was just being said by Jonathan, I think some of it is systemic. I think some of it is unintentional. I do believe there is unequal access to programs, and there's the need to break down some of the barriers. Part of what I think are the successful efforts are twofold. One, there have been more mobile efforts for healthcare and for reaching out to communities, as opposed to saying that the person, whether it's suffering from addiction or from mental health issues or somatic health issues, that he or she has to take this step to go to a facility or reach out and call someone in a governmental or non-governmental bureaucracy. We should flip that, and we should be going out to communities. As a result, I think two things have happened. You see more mobile health services, and as well, we've been seeing that with the vaccination attempts during the pandemic. But there are also more what they call patient navigators, who are reaching out to communities, to people who look like them, speak the same language, and can be more effective in bringing people along to talk about it, as we've been saying, and to get the care that he or she needs. There are several minority health initiatives in Montgomery County that specifically have been doing this for likely close to 20 years. There's a Latino health initiative, an African American health program, and an Asian American health initiative, looking at, for example, in the public health arena, what are the specific illnesses that may be more predominant in certain groups of people that's been documented through the medical community, and doing that specific research. In this arena, as we've been talking about with addiction, it's going out and having those conversations. And oh, by the way, if a navigator thinks there may be addiction issues, can bring into a conversation about what resources are there for them. So I think there are efforts, but it's trying to say, we're coming to help you. We're not asking you to come to us, because that unto itself is a barrier.
That's exactly right. And those for you who just are joining us, tonight we're discussing the two-part HBO documentary film, The Crime of the Century. We're waiting on the director of the documentary, Alex Gibney, to join us. And once he does, we'll jump right in and dive in and get some questions answered for him. But before we do that, I like to just replay the trailer so everyone can know what it is and what movie we're talking about. Michael, go ahead and roll the trailer.
I came out of the doctor's, and there was a representative of Purdue. She said, we have a drug called OxyContin. We pick up all the costs. Just take as much as you need. I said, sounds like a deal.
Within the last 20 years, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by overdoses. Controlled-release OxyContin would be the drug that triggered the opioid crisis. But what if we discovered that the crisis started with a crime?
When we talk about drugs like oxycodone, you're talking about drugs that are essentially heroin pills. Opioid makers started to promote their opioids for common chronic pain conditions.
Purdue didn't have any evidence that the drug was safe, so the company obtained the help of a medical officer at FDA.
This is the first time I've ever seen this. This isn't just unethical. I think this could be illegal.
Hundreds and hundreds of sales reps go out and meet with doctors and say, the FDA approved this.
Big Pharma celebrated its marketing muscle, using parties to lure doctors to write scripts.
This was a new drug cartel. There were drug dealers wearing suits and lab coats.
Basically, here's some money, write some scripts.
Yes, I'm looking at this and I'm going, clearly we're breaking the law.
Purdue ends up getting pursued by the authorities. The company lied under oath.
Ethics did not play a role. The companies took out their checkbooks and paid to keep the evidence hidden.
You are basically telling pharmaceutical companies you have a green light to do this.
It explains how America got hooked on opioids.
Doctors willing to be paid to prescribe the drug, those are the people that are going to get you promoted and eventually put you in prison.
The abuse exploded and spread like cancer.
When you're in that much pain and you're addicted to such a high dose, you're a trap rat.
When the companies didn't like that they were being held accountable, they decided to change the statute.
They should be changing their behaviors, not the rules.
People were dying by the tens of thousands, and their own representatives are basically selling them down the river.
If you talk to people whose lives have been touched, what does matter to a lot of these people is truth.
Again, that was the trailer for the two-part HBO documentary film, The Crime of the Century. Last year, Rockville Goes Purple highlighted the New York Times best-selling book, Dope Sick: Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America by author Beth Macy. From the pages to the screen. And today, again, we're going to highlight the two-part HBO documentary film, The Crime of the Century, which is a powerful documentary that explores the origins, extent, and fallout of one of the most devastating public health tragedies of our time, the opioid crisis. With 500,000 deaths from overdoses that in this century alone, the film reveals that America's opioid epidemic is not a public health crisis, that it didn't just come out of nowhere, okay? We're waiting for Mr. Gibney to join. I was told that he's trying to join right now, so the power of technology and new virtual. We'll just keep this conversation going too until I get word that he has joined, and we'll bring him right on into the conversation. Now, Jonathan, back to you. So I'm just going to go ahead and go back to you. What I wanted to know was when people are feeling helpless and hopeless in helping people with opioid addiction and trying to bring the awareness to this particular to this particular crisis. What is it? Some things that you can do? Like, how did you start your journey with that?
It became very personal for me very quickly, and not just because a family member of my own. And bless you, Chris, and congratulations on your recovery. But also, it's you realize that everyone who's out here hurting, everyone who is suffering from this, everyone who, and not just those people who are addicted, but those people who are suffering through helplessness of not being able to help their son, their daughter, their father, their sister. It's left us all feeling raw and alone. And one of the things that's really helped me on my journey is going around and talking to people and realizing that not only are we all do these stories unite us, but that it's inspiring people to put together resources. And one of the things I've seen so much of are people coming from this, whether personally or through other people that they know who are struggling, and realizing that we have to come up with new methods, coming up with resources for, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many resources out there for if you have a family member who's addicted and you need support yourself. We have that kind of support out there now. We have programs, new kinds of programs for recovery. New kinds of programs for inpatient and outpatient, long-term recovery programs. And we have advocates out there who are trying to make sure that the people in power, the people who, even if you don't want to hold them responsible for their role in this, you certainly should say to your leaders, to your community leaders, to your senators, to your representatives, that these programs are essential, that we don't just walk away from this. The chief of police here in Rockville, on an event that I was doing, he said one of the most powerful things I've heard about the opioid epidemic, which is we're never going to arrest our way out of this problem. It's true. This isn't a system that can just be fixed through the criminal justice system, and the support exists. The support is out there. I wonder if any of the council members or the mayor have any experience or know of any programs here in Rockville that are great support programs for people who are struggling, whether people struggling individually or people who are experiencing the community effects of this.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just going to jump in for 1 second because we do have a lot of programs that we connect with in the city, but also the comment you just made about we're not going to arrest our way out, and I've heard that before, and it speaks to something that Councilmember Ashton brought forward before, and the way we are treating this addiction crisis, this substance abuse crisis, as opposed to others 20 years ago, is really different. And I think that is something that we also need to talk about. Very, very difficult conversation of how we talk about how we treated people who were using substances back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s versus how we're treating them now. Not going to get into it right now. It's a tough, tough conversation. But, you know, I think the way we, as Americans, the way we in this country have treated people who use substances to self-medicate, to alleviate pain, to do other things, has been a very different, it's been very different across racial lines. And I think that that is wrong. I mean, I know it's wrong. I think it's been a very tough thing for us to talk about. I think what happened in this particular case, where there is clearly a profit gained by pharmaceutical companies, and a major, major profit, as you have known and others have mentioned. I mean, I think that that is where the blame lies in this particular instance. And the thing is that once people can no longer get the medication legally, they go into the other drugs illegally. And we have created this entire second tier. I'm not really sure what the word is, but, you know, we're culpable. Those of us who are understanding of what's going on and are not calling it out for what it is. And I thank you very much for what you've done and for what you've done with the city. You've brought a lot of information to us, Jonathan, and I've appreciated knowing from you, and I've appreciated the conversations that you have been part of over the last couple panels, that you've really helped us see, you know, where things have gone over the years, how it's gotten to the point that it is. And I challenge anyone, it is not the person who is suffering from abuse as much as it is the person who prescribed those opioids to get them there. What it has really done is challenged people who have a clear need for pain relief versus those who really could have done something else. And I know people, and a lot of seniors, I know people who are now very concerned about taking an opioid because they are afraid of being addicted or becoming addicted. And I think we have got to have a much clearer conversation and much clearer mentoring of watching of those individuals who have specific pain needs and what we're doing. And I just saw Councilmember Miles join the program. So welcome, Dr. Miles. But we're having this conversation, and I thank you, Jonathan and Kathy, for leading us forward. I'm not going to jump at you. You guys run the show, but I just wanted to let you know Dr. Miles was on the screen.
Mayor Newton, thank you so much for the kind words, and it's just been an honor to be a part of this. It's so often coming back to Rockville to speak, and it's just, it really is. It's such an important conversation that we need to keep having, and you know, you bring up some other interesting aspects to this. It's not as as you reiterated, we can't arrest our way out of it. It says so much more about what this problem is, and the mess of knots that we are in. There's an overreaction by many medical professionals who now will not prescribe any opioids because they're afraid of getting sued. There are patients who can't get opioids that they validly could use. There's a time and a place for the use of opioids. I always like to point out that we're so afraid of fentanyl right now for good reason, for very good reason. Fentanyl, in one of its earliest iterations, came as a lozenge. It came as a lollipop. Now, at first, that sounds like, were they trying to get kids to use it? No, fentanyl was originally designed for end-of-life cancer patients who couldn't swallow pills. And so they could take a lozenge and they could get their pain relief without the ability to swallow. Opioids in their earliest forms were for that kind of thing. When pharmaceutical companies were developing them, it was about breakthrough pain. It was about end-of-life care. And we have to re-educate our medical professionals, we have to re-educate our pharmacists, and we have to re-educate our everyday people to understand these are very dangerous, very deadly, very addictive drugs. They are also something that if they are prescribed to you, you should be concerned, but we should be able to rely on doctors prescribing them for the right reasons and in the right situations. It becomes a mess of things that we need to untangle before we can get things set right again. So it is certainly achievable, though, and I think one thing I will say I met Mayor Newton the first time because I came to talk about opioid litigation, and for anyone who's seen this national litigation, unfortunately I don't represent the city of Rockville, but that's okay. I'm out here doing this work, which is actually more important to me. But this opioid litigation is aimed at getting money back to the communities, aimed at getting money back to your city council, to your county council, to your health departments, so that they can fund the types of programs that we need to start implementing, not just to make up for the money that's been spent, but to try to implement new ways to move us forward. Now, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I am interested to hear if there are any proposed ideas or anything that that the council or the mayor could talk about what does Rockville see as important to moving forward away from the being right here in the middle of the opioid epidemic.
Go ahead, Dr. Miles. I saw your hand.
Oh, thank you, Madam Mayor. I think that's an excellent question. One of the reasons that I got excited about joining the council is because of this effort, the Rockville Goes Purple effort. I was amazed that a city that, at least on paper, doesn't appear to be as affected as some of our neighboring jurisdictions, to really take this issue seriously. And I think one of the things that was most impressive is that there was a thrust to first reduce the stigma and admit that a problem does exist, as though we are relatively, I wouldn't say relatively untouched, but there are other jurisdictions, for example, Baltimore City, who unfortunately is dealing with this in a much more significant manner. But it does touch home. Each person who is addicted, each death is somebody's child, somebody's mother, brother, sister, so on and so forth. So actually speaking about it makes a huge difference. I think there have been efforts with colleagues for other so-called gateway drugs to be very mindful about, things that, again, tangentially related, things like vape shops, making sure that we're doing all we can to keep them away from our schools. And I mean, as a pediatrician, I am part of the problem. I had some conversation about this before, the points that you all brought up, that the lack of training of medical professionals, and that, it's the only sort of certification you need to prescribe an opioid is to, finish medical school, but to be able to prescribe the antidote or, things to help people wean off of opioids, you have to do extra training. Like that seems like an unnecessary hurdle, though that's not a thing that a topic that you can address at the city. Raising awareness about the topic and then, letting our voices be heard in the respective venues when it comes to training is important. But I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues did prior to my even coming on council, and the work that we continue to do to raise awareness, to connect people to resources, to reduce stigma, admit that we have a problem, and do all that we can to try to fix it. I'll stop there. Thanks again for that question.
Dr. Miles, thank you so much. It's such an interesting perspective and a unique one. Now, I guess because I come from a regulatory background, I come from a DEA background. Have you seen changes not only in discussions in the medical community in terms of stigma, but have you seen changes in terms of an awareness of kind of maybe what went wrong or what needs to happen in the future? Are you seeing the medical profession taking those steps forward?
Unfortunately, not fast enough. I think that again, I'll start by saying, I work as a pediatrician, so I only see a particular segment of the age population, and I don't know necessarily what's going on in the adult population. I presume that something is being done. I just don't follow that literature as closely. But I have been trying to raise awareness within the pediatric community because oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes people's first exposure to opioids is, for example, they have a broken arm, they end up in the emergency room, and I'm prescribing, something to help them with pain. Before it was an opioid, that would be my first go-to. And there has not been enough focus, attention on that first encounter with opioids. So it's either the emergency room with a broken arm, broken leg, or the dentist office. And so unfortunately, I haven't seen enough done, to be quite honest, in terms of training, mandatory training. And then with that training, I haven't, there was a move, I think, under the, you know this better than me, under the previous presidential administration to make it a little easier to prescribe Suboxone. I don't know if the current administration is reinstating that rule change, but it just defies logic that no training is needed to prescribe an opioid, but to help somebody get off of it, you have to go through extra steps. That makes no sense to me. So to answer your question, certainly not enough is being done. That's all. Sorry.
I really appreciate your candor there.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I did some work with the CMS, and there was a big panel discussion that then Surgeon General Jerome Adams led. His family, he's openly shared, has been impacted directly as well. But I would encourage everyone to take a look at the Surgeon General Spotlight on Opioids. It's called Facing Addiction in America. It covers many of the topics that we discussed here, from disparities to what happened in industry and what people can do in their community. So I think it's an excellent read if you all are able to take a look at it. And to your question earlier about what we can do, I think for me, one of the big things I like to see about just really being more supportive to the recovery community and looking at substance use disorder as more of, again, a chronic issue, as we talk about many other health issues openly, to reduce the stigma, because unless we start to reduce the stigma, there are going to be people in the shadows not coming for help. I was personally impacted when someone in this community here in Rockville had a child who died of overdose, and I never knew there was ever a challenge. It's not something that ever was raised. And it really struck me that how much that family must have been going through and the pain they were going through alone. And I totally understand why that happened, but I wish that as a community, we can get to the point where we can be more open. I think Mayor and Councilman Feinberg and Dr. Miles mentioned it. We need more training as well. What if every one of our community associations was able to learn more about this, the problem, and had the Narcan training? That's something that we can consider. And I did want to raise one last point, is that we talk about the prescription access to opioids, but one of the biggest growth in the opioid use is also being done. There was a study done by this, posted in CDC, that looked at how the growth and the overdose deaths in the U.S. has occurred. And we're seeing an increasing growth of illicitly manufactured opioids. And I think that's also because as a parent, you want to know, how do I prevent this? It's not just the prescription you get at the clinician's office, but it's making its way to the streets. And so, I just want us to be aware when we're talking about prevention, it's not just, asking questions of your doctor and trying to make sure that you're managing your prescriptions and if you do need chronic pain, but we also have to be mindful in our community that there are other ways that people are accessing opioids, and to be aware. I think at its core, when you look at substance use disorder, people are trying to treat pain, whether that's physical pain, mental pain, spiritual pain. And I'm thankful that as a society, we're being more open about mental health in general. We need to continue on that path because there's so many lives we can save if we can see that sign early and reach out and lend a helping hand.
Thank you for all of that, Councilperson Ashton. I think that something that if people aren't aware, the concept of comorbidities and with a lot of opioid abuse, we are seeing that this is with any kind of substance abuse. You often see that it's not just a physical component and it's not just an escapist component, but there's also a mental health component. And something that, as you said, I think is really important. We have as a society are starting to move forward with discussing mental health as a very real thing, as a very real, not just problem, but as just something that exists in more ways than I think we as a society have really admitted until recent years. And a terrible stat, unfortunately, is that during COVID, and I know I cannot recall who, but someone brought this up earlier, that during COVID, we had to admit that there was a mental health component throughout the country. And there are now studies showing that, unfortunately, after years of our opioid deaths and overdose numbers going down, unfortunately, during COVID, we saw those numbers tick up again. And a lot of that has to do with the comorbidity and the people suffering from mental health and being isolated. This is the exact thing that this stigma we've been talking about all night, this is the exact thing that has isolated people, has made it so dangerous out there for people. And this is a big part of why not only the stigma of chemical dependency, of substance abuse, but also the stigma of mental health issues that are so tied in with so many stories here about people having substance abuse problems related to opioids. Kathy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Actually, I wanted to add someone. And it is Mr. Alex Gibney. Thank you so much. We had some technical issues, but he's joining us now. First of all, Mr. Gibney, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for being so generous as to guide me through the process of getting me on here. So thank you.
Yes. I would have waited forever for you.
Fort Knox.
I would have waited forever for you to join, so I'm fine. So let's go ahead and begin because I know your time is limited. I wanted to start first of all, but about what drew you to this documentary and why did you call it the crime of the century?
Well, what drew me to the documentary actually was I was having a meeting with a group of reporters from the investigative unit of the Washington Post, and they talked me through a kind of vast tale of the opioid crisis, but talked me through it and explained it to me in a way that I really hadn't understood it before. That it, because for so long, I had understood the opioid crisis as a kind of a crisis, as if it was a kind of natural disaster, like a flood or a hurricane or something like that, something that just happened. It's terrible. We're wringing our hands, but in their evocation of the story, it felt like something that was more like a crime rather than a crisis, something that was manufactured. And in that sense, I suddenly saw an opportunity for a telling story, and I called it the crime of the century, meaning the 21st century, because it just seems so vast in terms of how many perpetrators were involved, and also the body count was so high. So in that sense, it seemed apt to call it the crime of the century.
And you were able to obtain what was, I'll call the smoking gun against Purdue Pharma officials. And at the time, at least one FDA official. I want to talk about that. But first, I want to roll the clip that I'm talking about. Can we go ahead and roll that clip?
Wright allowed the company to claim that OxyContin was not very addictive or prone to abuse. Purdue executives camped out for 3 days in a rented room near Wright's office and worked with him to draft the official FDA review of OxyContin in a way that Wright promised would be promptly approved.
Okay, so this
This is a document that was leaked to us that showed a pretty unusual amount of interaction between Purdue officials and Curtis Wright at the FDA.
Wow. This is the first time I've ever seen this. This isn't just unethical. I think this could be illegal that they allowed Purdue to do this. And if it's illegal, it would look as though both Purdue and Curtis Wright may have broken the law. There's no way this should be allowed, that a drug company would be involved in drafting the review of its application.
Talk about smoking gun. I mean, first of all, how did you get that information? And then what did you think when you sort of put two and two together that someone in the FDA was giving somebody a heads up?
Well, it didn't take much for us to put two and two together when we got the document that Andrew Kolodny is reading from. And that document is something called a prosecution memo. It's about a 120-page document. And it was a document put together by some federal prosecutors who were investigating Purdue in 2004, 2005, 2006. And they did a pretty thorough job of investigating Purdue and recommended at the top of the Department of Justice that felony charges be brought against the highest executives at Purdue. Not yet the Sacklers, though I think there was some view that if these executives were charged with felonies, that then they might turn on the Purdue family. But the Department of Justice, under political pressure from people like Mary Jo White and Rudy Giuliani, as it happens, decided not to bring those felony charges, and they decided to reduce those charges to a misdemeanor. Nobody would serve any time in jail. There was a fine. But the most important thing about this 2007 settlement was that all of the evidence was buried. That was part of the agreement, the plea agreement. So all of the evidence in this prosecution memo just sat for years. And then I was able to obtain a copy of this document in the process of making the documentary. And it lays out just an extraordinary amount of evidence of how Purdue did what it did. And one of the things that's contained in the document is this unholy alliance with Curtis Wright. And so it was really an eye-opening moment to see the case against Purdue and to be so frustrated that it had never really been brought because it was kind of undermined by political pressures in Washington.
Mr. Gibney, first of all, I want to say it's good to see you again. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this with us. It's a real honor to have you here and to be a part of this. I actually wanted to ask you, given there are so many moments in this documentary that you will stand up from the couch and you will just curse or not, but certainly be angry about a lot of things that are being revealed. Were there any moments for you as you interviewed all the subjects in this that really, even with the research you'd done, that just were shocking, or you couldn't believe that someone would say what they were saying on camera?
Well, in terms of on camera, there is one moment. There's a man named Lynn Webster, who is a guy who ran the Lifetree Pain Clinic in Salt Lake City, Utah. And he also was very much of a paid advocate for a number of pharmaceutical companies in terms of going around the country and preaching the gospel of the opioid. I asked him a question, and I purposely exaggerated the number, I thought. I said, it's come to my attention that as many as 100 people may have died in your clinic from overdoses, opioids. What is your reaction? Is that a high number? Is what I said. And I expected him to say, oh, it's not 100, it's 70 or 50. But he responded, oh, I don't know. Is that a high number? And I thought, wow, 100 people died in his care, and he's wondering if that's a high number. So that was pretty shocking to me, I have to be honest. In terms of interviews, that was one of the most shocking things. But it was discovering the material in these documents that was really the most shocking. And then, of course, interviewing Alec Burlikoff, who was the salesman for a company called Insys, and discover the kind of routine criminality that that company engaged in terms of bribing doctors, in terms of, falsifying data to put claims through insurance companies, to really engage in activities that routinely put patients at risk of dying, all for profit. They had a return on investment chart, that documented how much they expected doctors to prescribe of this fentanyl-based product called Subsys, in order to, it had to be at least 2 times that the money they were paying them in bribes, or they'd stop the bribes. So it was just so jaw-droppingly out in the open in a way. And Alex Burlikoff, who had been convicted by the time we spoke to him, and we spoke to him with the permission of prosecutors, I think was willing to be as honest as he was, because he knew he was going down, and he felt it would be some benefit to him to talk about how the system worked. And maybe I should add one thing, Jonathan. The last thing that I think was shocking to me was, I had done other films in which I had talked about the revolving door in Washington, but I'd never seen anything sort of as ruthless as this in terms of the opioid story. And the degree to which prosecutors, some of whom, or lawyers, some of whom you work with, went and then were hired by pharmaceutical companies to push bills through Congress that literally put, people at enormous risk. And these small amendments to bills, which had enormous consequences, were passed by unanimous consent in the House and in the Senate. I even talked to former Senator Al Franken recently, and he said, "Yeah, I was one of those people who must have just said, sure, fine," because nobody has time to read the stuff. They didn't even read it. So I must say that this project led me to one shocking bit of testimony or documentation after another, and that's why, to your question, Kathy, I think that we called it the crime of the century.
And you just spoke of Alec Burlikoff. I want to give our viewers and the people that joined us an opportunity just to hear this man talk and explain his Whiffleman pill. Roll the clip, please.
There's 4 categories. There's blue, yellow, green, red. Blue is analytical. That means if you don't have a scientific, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with a lot of patients that proves your data is right, you're not getting a sale. What does that mean to me? It means I don't call on analytical doctors because I don't have any studies like that. Then you have your yellow, that's your amiable doctor. They want to be friends with everybody. They want everybody to love them, which means if you're selling a drug and there's 5 other competitors, they just go in a rotation. This one gets Subsys, this one gets Lozanda, this one gets Abstral, and then we go back around. Guess what? They're out because they're just sharing the wealth. So now you got your green, which is kind of like your earthy type of doctor. Like, God forbid you do a lunch and not recycle, you'll never go back there again. But then you got your reds. Reds are your businessmen. They own their practice, they run their practice, they manage their books, they see a crazy number of patients. It's all about efficiency. In fact, when you as the rep walk in there, they run to you with a pen to sign, and they're running away at the same time because they don't have time to talk with you because they're treating patients making money. And if he's a red and he's a businessman, I gotta show him the WIFM. What is the WIFM? WIFM. What's in it for me? That's all they're thinking. What's in it for me? Buddy, will you stop talking about the freaking drug? Will you stop talking about saving the patient? Will you stop talking about the science? And will you please tell me what's in it for me because you're wasting my time? Those are the reds. Those are the doctors you want to find. And those are the doctors you want to move in, live, eat, and breathe with.
And with that, and like I said earlier in our discussion before you joined us, Mr. Gibney, I had to watch my words because my mother said, if you can't say nothing good about somebody, don't say nothing at all. I was really shocked how this man was so bold and just to even put a little acronym with him. Like it wasn't nothing big about it. I'm sure that shocked you too, Mr. Gibney. I'm sure.
It did. I mean, my jaw and the jaws of all our crew sort of dropped after we heard Alec go on and on and on and on and on about what he did. And to be honest with you, I actually have to give Mr. Burlikoff credit because, one of the federal prosecutors was sitting in the room when we did the interview. But this is, like I say, after he had been convicted. And, he was, he showed remorse over and over and over again. But once he got into talking about how the actual business practices worked, he transformed himself into who he was back then. And with a certain amount of glee and pride, he walked us through exactly how it worked. And that was enormously valuable. Because you can see in his enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Mind you, it's a terrible enthusiasm because what he's talking about is a business model to find bad doctors who don't care about their patients. But it conveyed how something like this worked, which is what always interests me in doing films like this, is to understand how the crimes are committed. Because only when you understand that can you stop them.
Exactly. And watching this documentary, I went through a range of emotions. I was mad, I was frustrated, and then I got hopeless because it's like if the government is not protecting, there's no laws in place, there's pharmaceutical companies that can flash money at doctors to get them to overprescribe, and Big Pharma still getting rich behind all of this. Do you think there's hope? I mean, is this just trying to find some form of accountability for all this?
I do think there's hope. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, we've allowed the system to become broken and to be infected with money in a way that's terribly hard to correct. But the more we learn and understand the system, the more important it is for us to speak out. Because if we lose hope, then we become cynical. And that, in a way, is to the advantage of Big Pharma and the people who do their bidding in Congress, because they know we won't care. But if we really hold these people's feet to the fire and also do more than just cast our votes, but to organize, to make our voices heard, it can make a difference. And ultimately it will. But what they depend on, in a way, is our cynicism. And yet, it is hard sometimes to see that ray of hope, because you realize that it's not as simple as a bad doctor. It's a whole system that rewards bad doctors, and it's being willing to find our voice, and also to ensure that our representatives understand that. And if they don't, they're out. So I think understanding the system is hard because it paints a bleak picture, but I don't think it's hopeless. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to get it right and insist that the people who represent us get it right, because if they don't, then we're all at risk.
Mr. Gibney, what ultimately are you hoping that the viewers of this documentary are going to walk away with? What are you hoping that they're getting from the story you're telling?
I hope they see that, number one, a lot of people have been told blame the addicts, like it's their fault. It's like, somebody gets hooked on opioids, it's a personal problem. When you see this documentary, you understand that the opioid crisis was manufactured. And it's not manufactured in a way, it's not like these companies went out and said, we want to kill people. It's just, it didn't matter to them so much if they did or didn't. They had a model that was reckless, that marketed opioids to people who didn't need it, that actually leaned into a system whereby they would supply pill mills and illicit distribution of narcotics, in order to make money, right? So what I want people to come away with is an understanding of how that system works. And once you understand it, then you can begin to speak out and you can begin to tell your representatives that we're not going to stand for it anymore. So you have to understand the system and how it works before you can do something about it.
One thing, Mr. Gibney, because this documentary is it's just great storytelling. So I would just like to ask you a question as a documentarian. How do you even put something like this together that has so many moving parts? And I mean, I know that the Washington Post, their investigative journalist team, I know it started maybe with their article or their paper or the article they had in the Post, but how do you like craft something like this? Because this is the way you did it. I'm fanning out. You were phenomenal. Because I don't watch documentaries. So
thank you, Kathy. You're very kind. So look, I mean, I think that the challenge here always is, I remember I did a documentary once about a company we all may remember called Enron. And the mantra was, it's not about the numbers, it's about the people. So it's finding characters in a story to tell a story like this on a human level so that you can really feel the breath of the characters involved. I think that's really what matters. Now, we understood the broad stroke of the story that we wanted to tell in terms of, how it starts with the advertising mechanisms of Purdue and then, people end up getting hooked and they turn to fentanyl and, it was a big and vast tale we wanted to tell, but we knew we couldn't tell it without key human characters who would give us a sense of the intimacy of that story. So it's juxtaposing the kind of panoramic scope of the tale with the intimate human drama of people, living this one day at a time. And that's why, finding somebody like Alec Verlikoff or finding somebody like Lynn Webster or the salesman from Purdue, Mark Ross, or, some of the people who are fighting back. Every step along the way, we looked for key characters who could bring this story to light. And I think that's really what it's about. That's the mantra we learned from Enron. It's not about the numbers, it's about the people.
Yeah, and speaking of Emma, you did a documentary on that too, didn't you? Yes,
I did.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did, and we appreciate your work. I believe Rockville Mayor Newton had a question. If I'm not mistaken, I was told that maybe she had a question for you, Mayor Newton.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm not sure if I had a question, but Mr. Gibney, I just want to say thank you so much for joining with us tonight and for your work, not just on this documentary, which is very dear to my heart, but on all the other things that you've done. And you've made a couple comments about how it's about the people, and that is what it's about. It is about the people. And if we can stop thinking about the reward financial, that, and that is what led Enron, that's what led the opioid crisis, that's what's led so many of our really negative situations in this country. If we could just take that away, I think we'd be a better place. So thank you for all the work you're doing to shine a light on really the people, because that is what it's all about. I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do agree with you. There's that phrase, the bottom line, and the bottom line has come to be a phrase of sort of, that's the, that's how we reckon whether something is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think it's a terrible phrase because the bottom line seems to indicate that it's only a good thing if you make a profit. And we've got to think beyond that. We understand, we're all of us live in a system of the market, but when the money is the only thing that matters and we allow human values to be trampled, then we're in a lot of trouble. So yes, I appreciate your comment.
And I believe Councilmember Ashton had something. I'm just trying to make sure that everyone has an opportunity.
Well, I want to thank you for your bravery and doing this, because you had to uncover a lot of difficult things that I'm sure people didn't want uncovered. But I was curious in your perspective, given that there was the marketing was a problem, but also there were a variety of surveillance systems that pointed to problems early on. The DEA had some information. So I was just curious as what changes do you think need to happen more broadly so that this never happens again?
Well, it's a good question, and I may not be the most qualified person to answer the question. Jonathan might even be more qualified than certainly is more qualified than I am. I think the revolving door is one area that we really need to take a look at. When you have people who really have a great role in terms of regulating these companies and keeping them honest, and when they understand that they can flip that experience into much more profitable career after they leave their position as regulators, it creates both a problem while they're regulators and a huge problem afterwards. So that's a big thing that I think if we could get right would be an enormous boon to the system, because you can't have a system whereby there is no regulation because everyone's waiting for that big golden ticket when they leave the regulator's office in order to be able to get the money that they never got as regulators.
Mr. Gibney, I completely agree with your assessment there. And it is one of the problems. The other problem is just the money in politics, the amount of money that the distributors spent to rewrite the law through not only hiring people who were expert regulators, but by funding candidates and funding politicians who went out and literally rewrote the Controlled Substances Act in order to stop DEA from being able to regulate. I know that not a lot of people, there are some people who disagree with that interpretation, but the fact remains that the Marino Act changed the controlled substances law, and that Marino Act was funded entirely by the companies that make these drugs, so that that DEA couldn't come in and shut them down if they were problematic. It's another aspect of this that I think that if we're going to really talk about not only regulators, but how our government interacts, I think you need to have a really difficult conversation about money in politics.
I agree. And there's one other thing about money in politics, which I would say, because I think it is at the root of a lot of these problems. As one of the Washington Post reporters points out in the film, this amendment of the Controlled Substances Act, he's pretty sure that nobody really read it. And why didn't they read it? Well, I'll hazard a guess that the reason they didn't read it was because they're busy. And what are they busy doing? They're busy raising money, because it becomes an all-consuming practice. I know, I rarely give the candidates, but in 2020, I was motivated for a lot of reasons to give some candidates for what I felt were existential reasons. And the day after the election, I'm besieged by more requests for more money. And I know for a fact from talking to some congressmen and some senators that is the life they lead. They in order to stay elected, they have to be constantly raising money. Well, if you're raising money all the time, you're not doing any legislating. And so that becomes the kind of pernicious game that we really need to address. We need to take money out of politics. I couldn't agree more.
Exactly. Dr. Wells, I thought I saw your hand raised.
Thanks so much. And I just wanted to echo the thanks of my colleagues to you, Mr. Gibney. I think that I don't need to tell you, but I really appreciate your shining a light on these matters in a way that breaks through all the news media cycles that we get overwhelmed with, dealing with the pandemic and whatnot. The way that film really transcends and really highlights a topic like, Enron, which I saw in the past that you did in this one as well. So thank you for your work, and thanks for being here this evening.
Thank you very much.
And certainly, last but not least, Councilmember Feinberg, did you have a question?
Not so much a question. I also want to extend my thanks to Mr. Gibney for sharing his time and expertise with us. In regard to the comments that have just been shared recently, I think two other issues have been going on. One, I think we need stronger whistleblower protections for people in government or in business who want to do the right thing but are really afraid. And the second has been there's so much misinformation out there, and there's been the death, it's been reported, of many local newspapers. The journalists, we need more of them, and unfortunately the newspapers that would support their investigative reporting have been dying across this country. And so there's also a need for more information and accurate information so people can look for facts and they don't just get their information basically from, Twitter, Facebook, and very short-lived bursts of supposed facts.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Feinberg. Mr. Gibney, I know that we cut into some other time you had, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up because you're a very busy man. Thank you so much for spending this little time with us and giving us, a peek inside that beautiful mind of yours, creating these documentaries for us to learn and be educated, especially about the opioid crisis, because our Rockville Goes Purple campaign, our theme was opioids, let's talk about it. And this film definitely is a conversation starter.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy, and thanks for being so patient with my computer incompetence. So, and thank you all, and it's good to talk to you.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great night, Mr. Gibney.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Gibney.
Take care.
And
Thank you
again,
for joining us.
okay. And again, the two-part HBO documentary film, The Crime of the Century, is available right now on demand on HBO and on HBO Max. All right, you guys, we're going to wrap this up. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And please, please, please keep the conversation going. Take the time and watch the two-part documentary. It, again, is on HBO and HBO Max. And if you have someone that you know that is struggling with opioid addiction, or if you yourself need help, there's support out there, and you're not alone. We've compiled a list of resources on our website at rockvillemd.gov/Rockville Goes Purple for the Mayor and Council and for the City of Rockville. And thanks to my co-host, Mr. Jonathan Novak. I'm Kathy Dantzler. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, Rockville.
Thanks, everybody.